Okay, in this video, I'd like to give you the lesson on the French and Indian War that we would have done in class today. So first, we have to understand the significance of the French and Indian War. The first question is this: to what extent was 1763 a turning point in British colonial relationships? Well, it's a bit of a rhetorical question. It is a huge turning point in British colonial relationships. We know from our previous unit that at the end of the French and Indian War, the period of salutary neglect ended, which means enforcement of the rules came back, as well as what we predicted to, new taxes and new regulations that would come from 1763 with the Proclamation Line to the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Declaratory Act, the Townshend duties, then events like the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party. All of that comes after 1763. So that really is the slippery slope to the revolution. But the context of the French and Indian War is so important for understanding that. This was a monumental war that affected the colonies, affected the British Empire, created a huge amount of debt, but more importantly, it created friction between the mother country and her colonies. And that's why it's such an important turning point to understand. Which really gets to this next question. How did this conflict set the stage for the American Revolution? Well, obviously that friction is what led to the eventual break. But at the core of this and that friction was a disagreement on what are the proper rights and liberties within the British Empire. Are colonists being treated like any Englishmen? Are they being guaranteed those same rights? That was the core debate. When you hear no taxation without representation, it's not that the colonists didn't want to be taxed. Taxes are a part of life. It was that they believed that the taxation was unfair, and by being passed by a parliament 3,000 miles away, that colonists were not receiving the same rights as any Englishmen to have direct representation by that taxing authority. And that's just one piece of the debate. Quartering soldiers, territorial lines, and other rights will all become part of this debate. And so the French and Indian War sets that stage for the American Revolution. So first we have to look at what was the map like prior to the American Revolution, or excuse me, prior to the French and Indian War. Well, notice, of course, here was the French. The French occupied the interior of the continent. As you remember from our last unit, they were doing fur trading, establishing very good relationships with Native Americans, whereas the British did not have such great relations with Native Americans. Another thing that was going on at this time is that British colonies were growing. As agricultural production increased, life in the colonies got better, life expectancy in the colonies became even better than those in Europe. The British colonies started to grow, whereas the French are not transplanting huge populations to New France. They're here for business interests. So as the British colonies spread west, they spread into French territory, creating conflicts with Native American groups as well as the French themselves. And so really, both sides were spoiling for a fight. And this is just a review of the French in North America, which we discussed in the last unit. But as a review, the empire grew with Louis XIV. Remember the Edict of Nantes and the significance of that in 1598 for religious groups like the Huguenots. And in 1608, the French plant themselves firmly in North America with the settlement of Quebec. I mentioned on the last slide that French fur trappers were primarily the main economic engine of New France, and they spread across the continent. You can see the evidence of this with the names of many towns in the interior of the continent, like Terre Haute, Indiana, or Des Moines, Iowa, or St. Louis, Missouri, all have that French influence. The French formed allies with local natives. They traded with them. Of course, the French are also, like other European powers in the Caribbean, growing sugar. You may also remember that when William and Mary ascended to the throne with the Glorious Revolution, it began that period of salutary neglect. Well, one of the reasons for salutary neglect is the British were distracted. There were a series of world wars that began in Europe but spread to America. And so what I've done here is I've lined them up for you. On the right-hand side are the names of those wars in Europe that you may have learned about in world history. The War of the League of Augsburg, the War of Spanish Succession, the War of Austrian Succession, which began as the War of Jenkins' Ear. But these world wars, which started in Europe, did spread to the colonies and involved American colonists. So Americans had an experience with this type of imperial struggle. For example, King William's War, which began here in 1689. Queen Anne's War is notable for us locally because St. Augustine was put under siege by the English from Charlestown. The people of St. Augustine stayed in the fort, the Castillo de San Marcos, and remained there to survive the siege. And the city was actually defended by free blacks from Fort Mose, which is just north of the city gates. Some of those free blacks were former English slaves that had escaped. So quite a diverse history there as well. And then King George's War, which would have been in recent memory for some older American colonists at the time of the French and Indian War, occurred from 1744 to 1748 in the colonies. Well, in this war in particular, New Englanders had captured the important French fort of Lewisburg. Let me go back to the previous slide here, or this one here. Notice where Lewisburg is. This French fort had really impeded efforts by New Englanders to fish in this region. This area here had extremely good waters for fishing cod and other types of marine life. But with the French having a defensive fort here, they essentially controlled all traffic heading this way towards the St. Lawrence River. So this was a big win for New Englanders. They were ecstatic that they were able to capture this fort, and many New Englanders died capturing this fort. Well, in the Treaty of Utrecht in 1748, the British just handed the fort back to the French, and New Englanders were outraged. So maybe the friction was already beginning prior to the French and Indian War. So let's get to the war itself. The first clash happens in this region of the forks of the Ohio. It's where the Ohio River splits into the Allegheny and the Monongahela rivers. This area was claimed all by Virginia. Now today we know it's Pennsylvania, but the whole region was claimed by Virginia. The region was also claimed by the French. And so the French, hoping to stake their claim to the region, built a fort where the Ohio splits, called Fort Duquesne. Today this is the city of Pittsburgh. Well, when the English learned that the French had established a fort there at Fort Duquesne, the governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, sent his young militia colonel, George Washington, who was a 20-something at the time, out to the backwoods there near Fort Duquesne to warn the French that they were in English territory. Well, the way the story goes is that Washington ran into a detachment of French troops. He thought that they were going for their weapons, and he ordered his men to open fire. That event, as Horace Walpole said here, the volley fired by a young Virginian in the backwoods of America set the world on fire. That event was the beginning of the French and Indian War in 1754. So the war begins in America and is principally a war between British colonists and their Indian allies and the French and their Indian allies, which are much more numerous than the British. That war becomes 2 years later a larger world war. You learned it as the 7 Years' War. So right at the beginning of the war, the British say, okay, you've started this mess. We need the colonies to come together and work together for their own defense. It's time for the colonies to take a step and defend themselves with their militias. And so Ben Franklin calls the Albany Congress, and the whole goal of the Albany Congress was to achieve some unity to address the French, but also maybe organize other tribes and hopefully pull some tribes over to their side, like the Iroquois, which failed. But the plan that they come up with Albany, which only New England colonies and a couple other colonies were represented at this conference anyways, but the plan that they come up with Albany is a plan for home rule. Home rule means that the colonies would unite together under one general, maybe loose governing body, but have some form of semi-independence while still under the British system. Well, this isn't received well in the other colonies. People from Virginia have no interest in being with people with Massachusetts. They can't imagine being in a government together. And for the British, they say, yeah, absolutely not. That's not going to happen. So the Albany Plan of Union fails. But it's important because it's planting the seed of this idea of eventual unity. This famous political cartoon, the Join or Die cartoon, is actually from Ben Franklin, and it was to get colonies to support the Albany Plan of Union in 1754. Now the image comes back during the Revolution, but it doesn't originate from the Revolution. It originates from the French and Indian War. So let's talk about the course of the war. Now, we're not really concerned about all the nitty-gritty battles, because really all we want to know about this war is why it's significant. Well, the British send Edward Braddock, and Braddock has a huge ego. Braddock doesn't listen to the colonial concerns. He doesn't listen to the colonial militia who actually know the territory. He doesn't really recognize George Washington as being a colonel, recognizes him as just the lower rank of captain. But Washington goes along. He figures that he can learn a lot from Braddock. But Braddock, a great example of his ego is that he gets himself killed in battle. Braddock goes too far. He throws his army at the French, and it's a disaster. They were completely unprepared for this. Some colonists probably were shaking their heads going, "We told you so." And Braddock himself is killed. So there's really friction emerging very quickly with the British over the management of this war. A lot of the attacks that the British were doing were just along the frontier settlements against the Indians, and they weren't very well managed. The British are still approaching this like they would approach any European war, but America's different, and especially fighting Indian tribes is different. Well, in 1757, William Pitt becomes the new foreign minister. William Pitt is the namesake for Pittsburgh. And notice, Fort Duquesne, that's where it started. That's how Pittsburgh gets its name. Well, Pitt understands the colonial concerns. He listens to them. He removes the chief commander of military forces in America, Lord Loudon, and instead helps to manage the war by giving the colonists a voice. The other military strategy that changes is that the shift goes away from just trying to attack and penetrate a few forts on the frontier to the British launch a massive invasion into the heart of New France, and specifically taking out Quebec. And when Quebec fell, Quebec being the linchpin, when Quebec fell, so did the rest of New France. But as I said, what's more important than just the battles are the tensions. So let's review those here. First are the methods for fighting. Again, colonists said to the British, hey, this isn't going to work. Military organization. Colonial militias weren't as organized as the British. The British, of course, top-down approach. They want to control everything. Professional army. And you see that here as well. The British are bringing professional trained soldiers. These people are paid. This is what they do. Whereas colonists are farmers. And it's essentially farmers who are grabbing the weapon they use for hunting and joining up the militia, which means they can come and go as they please. This angers the British, but this is how things have been done in the colonies. Again, miscommunication is a big piece here. Finances. Not only were colonists resistant to any extra taxes for this, but also New Englanders were still trading with French companies in clear violation of the Navigation Acts. As for demeanor, one thing that really annoyed colonists was these prima donna British officers that would come over to fight this war in America, but they came with the full tea servings and with servants and fine china, and all that stuff has to be carried over land out to the frontier to fight these battles. Let's look at some documentary evidence. This example, first we look at a source line. Now, you may remember from world history last year how we approach critical reading, the HIP, which actually the HIP strategy comes from AP U.S. history. Whenever we look at a document and use it as supporting evidence, we have to think of what is the historical context, that's the H, who's the intended audience, what's the purpose, and what's the point of view. And of course, in finding those four elements, we get a sense of what's the main message. So the first thing we want to do is look at the source line. Well, we know the historical context is the French and Indian War. The date here helps us with that. And it's a Massachusetts soldier's diary. When you write a diary, you usually think that a diary is private. So the intended audience here is himself, which means he can be more candid, he can be more blunt and honest. Whereas if he was writing a letter that might be read by somebody else, he might not be as blunt. But there's a key passage as you read this, and it's this one here. And we, being here within stone walls, are not likely to get liquors or clothes at this time of the year. And though we be Englishmen born, we are debarred Englishmen's liberty. Therefore we now see what it is to be under martial law and to be with the British regulars, who are but little better than slaves to their officers. Notice the friction, and notice this point. This Massachusetts soldier is saying, I'm an Englishman just like he's an Englishman. Why am I being treated like a second-class citizen? And that friction only grows. So what's the result? Well, the French are knocked out of New France, or Canada, really by 1761, 1762. Of course, the rest of the war, the 7 Years' War, goes on around the globe, in India and Southeast Asia and in Europe. The results of the Treaty of Paris, well, the French lose Canada. They lose most of India, and they lose claims east of the Mississippi, which is this whole territory here. Lost my mouse. Here we go. This whole territory here. Spain gains lands west of the Mississippi. So this territory, which later becomes Mexico in 1821, they do gain New Orleans, but eventually they give that back to the French. Same with the Louisiana territory. But they do lose Florida. So as we're thinking about the 450th anniversary next week, this is our 20-year British period in Florida history. And we can see evidence of this actually in St. Augustine. When you look at some of the older dwelling spaces on St. George Street, or especially on Albany Street, south of the plaza, you can find these homes and these buildings that have very Spanish architecture on the first story with that rounded coquina, but on the second story they have wooden roof lines that are pointed and balconies, very much like what you would find in Charleston. The British built the second stories. So St. Augustine's really a neat mix that you can see a lot of the Spanish heritage, but you can definitely find elements of the British heritage. The British, of course, gain all of Canada, exclusive rights to the slave trade in Britain. They gain Florida, as well as the sphere of influence in India, which I'm sure you covered in depth last year. Why is this significant? Well, look at the comparison here. Britain gets a much larger empire, but also a huge amount of debt. And when officers that are working the king's treasury, the people who are in charge of essentially managing the budget for the entire government, when they analyze this, they say, wait a second, we spent all of this revenue defending the colonies. What did they contribute in return? What taxes are they providing back to the crown? Also, as they started to look at the issue of smuggling, they realized that for too long the colonists have gotten away with breaking the rules. That's why the rules come back. That's why new rules are passed. That's the logic. If we try to explain why did the British take the actions that they did in that period that led to the American Revolution, this is the context. As for Americans, it is the first unifying event and a shared experience that they all have. It's a chance for socialization. It's a chance for confidence and pride. Hey, for colonists, they believe that they fought this war well, and look, they defeated the French, and now we can spread west. See, the British don't think that they fought that hard. They don't think that they've actually done that well. Also in America, there's some contempt for the mother country. They didn't like those redcoats staying in their towns. Remember that many of Britain's professional soldiers come from the lowest classes in England. They were known for drinking. They were known sometimes even for stealing. And so that part, that element, created a distaste for British soldiers already. And as I mentioned, colonists believed that, hey, the Indians are defeated, the French are defeated, we should have the right to move west. Well, right after the war, we have this one event known as Pontiac's Rebellion. Pontiac's Rebellion illustrates to us the challenge for Indian tribes who allied themselves with the French. The French had more Indian allies than the British, and now with the French protection gone, many of these tribes had to decide, do we make peace with the British or do we try to fight? Well, Chief Pontiac led a rebellion and led a fight against Fort Detroit. Fort Detroit, founded by Antoine Cadillac. Notice the car names, by the way. And so after Pontiac's Rebellion, which was crushed by the British, and by the way, normally Indian rebellions were handled by colonial militias. The British don't feel at this point that the colonies know what they're doing and that colonial militias can actually handle their own defense. So the British bring in regular troops, crush the rebellion. Also, as a side story, the survivors of Pontiac's tribe, they invite them into Fort Detroit and then give them blankets. Well, that's nice, except that the blankets were purposely infected with smallpox from people who had previously died of smallpox at Fort Pitt. And so Pontiac's survivors died. But after this event, the logic back in London was, if more of our colonists move west, we have more conflicts with Indians. If we have more conflicts with Indians, we have to send more troops. If we have to send more troops, then we're further into debt. So we'll solve the problem by drawing a proclamation line. That's this green line that you see here on the map. We'll draw this line and we will forbid our colonists from moving west of that line. Now, of course, how do you enforce a border that long, right? Now, colonists are outraged. In fact, there's even one group of backcountry people, remember they're the troublemakers, the Paxton Boys, who march west of the line and settle west of the line to see what the British will do about it, which they don't do much at first. But the reason this is significant is this is the beginning of the crackdown by the British and the beginning of resistance by colonists. And while they, at the time, didn't see where this was going, we, as historians, we see exactly where this is going. This is going right to the American Revolution. And that's why we have to pay attention to it so closely. So our next class, we will meet in the Learning Commons to build presentations on that event, on that road to revolution. It is very, very, very important that you read the articles prior to class and participate in the discussion forum prior to class so that you have a good context to build those presentations. Now, I do have this link that says watch this clip to help set the stage, and I'd like to show you that clip. It is on YouTube. I can't play it here and then republish it on YouTube, but I will post a link to this here onto Schoology so that you can look at it. So I hope this was a helpful lesson for you. Please make sure that you're keeping up with the readings, that you're looking at the study guide, that you're reviewing consistently so that we have good results and that we understand this unit well.